North Carolina's Board of Elections has heard enough.
Yeah, days of testimony persuaded the board that a congressional election was tainted. Witnesses described how a political operative mishandled absentee ballots. The operative was working for Republican candidate Mark Harris. Even his own son offered damaging testimony before Harris gave in.
It's become clear to me that the public's confidence in the 9th District seat general election has been undermined to an extent that a new election is warranted.
NPR's Miles Parks has been covering this story all along. Hey there, Miles.
Hi, Steve.
What made it clear to Mark Harris that his apparent win by 905 votes was just not going to stand?
So this really came down to the viability of Mark Harris's version of events. For months since the election, he has said he knew nothing about the absentee ballot scheme that investigators have been laying out, which was performed by a man named McCrae Dallas in the eastern part of the 9th District. Mark Harris said he knew nothing about that and that he was not warned about Dallas's potentially illegal tactics. But that has been losing steam all week long. We heard testimony on Wednesday, which was really key, from actually Mark Harris's son, John Harris, who's an assistant U.S. attorney in North Carolina. John said he warned his father specifically about Dallas's tactics. Here's a clip.
I love my dad, and I love my mom. I think that they made mistakes in this process, and they certainly did things differently than I would have done them.
And isn't there evidence that he did warn them? There was emailed evidence as well as verbal warnings?
There was one especially damning email in there where he sent an email with the North Carolina statute that laid out how it was illegal to collect ballots, which is what McCrae Dallas is accused of doing. What Mark Harris says is that he just didn't heed his son's warnings. His son was based in D.C. at the time. He had never been to Bladen County, and Mark Harris says he just chalked it up to youth, that he believed McCrae Dallas's denials that he was collecting ballots over his son's warning, which were based on this data analysis that he'd been doing on election results from previous elections in Bladen County.
Okay, so we have this finding of bogus activity in the election, a very close election. It will be rerun. Is Mark Harris, the guy whose campaign was guilty of this behavior, is he allowed to run again?
He is allowed to run again. The question at this point is whether he will run again. We know that in North Carolina, it's required to not only hold a new general election at this point, but also a new primary process. So it's really unclear whether Mark Harris is going to be able to gather that Republican support in the state after he has all of this baggage from this week-long hearing. Whether he's going to be able to gather support from Republicans and take on Democrat Dan McCready again in the general election is still really unclear. He hasn't even said that he is going to run yet.
I suppose there's also the question as to whether this will become one more Democratic seat at the end of this 2018 election, in which a lot of Democrats won seats in the House of Representatives, or whether Republicans would hold it. How Republican had this seat been up to now?
It had been very Republican in recent years, but Democrats are definitely excited about the possibility of having another shot at this. Obviously, the whole fact that we're here at all is based on the fact that this was a very close election in 2018. And since Dan McCready, the Democrat who was running against Mark Harris, since he rescinded his concession after Election Day, he has raised a lot of money in the weeks and months following that. So Democrats are expecting. They've also made election security a huge campaign point looking ahead to 2020. You connect that with the fact that McCready's been able to fundraise. Democrats are really excited about this possibility.
Miles, thanks very much.
Thank you.
That's NPR's Miles Parks. Police in Chicago have offered some of the evidence that a hate crime was faked.
Yeah, we're talking about the alleged attack on Jussie Smollett, an actor in the series Empire. Police Superintendent Eddie Johnson says the attack, the racial slurs, even the rope around Smollett's neck were false.
This stunt was orchestrated by Smollett because he was dissatisfied with his salary. So he concocted a story about being attacked.
Now, police and prosecutors say Smollett paid the attackers by check, although the actor is still maintaining his innocence.
We're joined now by Paris Schutz, a correspondent for Chicago Tonight on WTTW, Chicago Public Media. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
What information stood out for you as police and prosecutors laid out their case?
just the specific detail that Cook County prosecutors had on this, all the evidence that they had compiled, text messages, interviews with witnesses, and they outlined their case yesterday in court, where Smollett allegedly sent a text message to his friend Abel Usendero, who is an extra on Empire. The text reads, quote, "Might need your help on the low, you around to meet up and talk face to face." At this point, Smollett, as Johnson mentions there in the open, is upset that a threatening letter that police say he sent himself, although that hasn't been proven yet, was not getting the attention he wanted to receive. So he talks to Abel. Abel introduces him to his brother Ola. Smollett asks Ola if he can trust him, and then he hatches this alleged fake plan with him.
And then, of course, we have the check as well at the end of that. I want to play Police Superintendent Eddie Johnson again. Let's listen.
To put the national spotlight on Chicago for something that is both egregious and untrue is simply shameful.
People in Chicago do not seem happy to be associated with this.
Oh, including the police superintendent, as you can hear in his voice there. The mayor of Chicago, Mayor Rahm Emanuel, issued a long statement condemning what happened and making sure that everybody knows Chicago is a place of tolerance. There are a lot of people that have signs in their homes that say hate has no home here. And Emanuel wanted to drive home the fact that people here really mean that. And Eddie Johnson reserves that kind of emotion for particularly heinous crimes that happen, that he comes and talks about. He says you have to wonder what's going through this man's mind. And in Chicago, as people around the nation know, the homicide rate is really high, and more than 80% of those murders go unsolved. Juxtapose that with this case where 24 detectives were working on it from the beginning. It was a so-called heater case, so much media attention on it, and charges were brought relatively quickly in this. So there's frustration that crimes, like there was the murder of a 1-year-old recently, and they have no leads on that, but this one got solved right away.
A heater case, meaning one that got the publicity and therefore got the resources.
Exactly.
Paris Schutz, thanks very much.
Thank you.
He is with Chicago Tonight on WTTW Chicago Public Media and joined us via Skype. At the request of Pope Francis, bishops gathered in Rome to address sex abuse in the Catholic Church.
This 4-day summit began on Thursday with a victim from Africa offering extraordinary testimony detailing how she had been raped by her priest, leading her to have 3 abortions over a dozen years. An influential cardinal from the Philippines, Luis Antonio Tagle, acknowledged the church's responsibility in the abuse.
We humbly and sorrowfully admit that wounds have been inflicted by us, bishops, on the victims.
NPR's Sylvia Poggioli is in Rome covering the summit. Hi, Sylvia.
Hi, Steve.
What's the goal of this gathering?
You know, keep in mind that in the past, the Catholic Church treated clerical sex abuse as an issue of sin and forgiveness. Now it's being pressed to treat it as a crime that requires punishment. The Pope wants that every bishop here leaves Rome knowing exactly what he has to do in cases of priests abusing children in terms of responsibility, accountability, and transparency. He wants them to understand that abuse is not a first world problem, but a global phenomenon. And to press that point, as you said, there were these videos of these traumatic testimonies of 5 anonymous abuse survivors. One man accused church officials of having turned into murderers of the soul. And the Pope also handed out a list of 21 concrete proposals, most of which have already been adopted in the U.S., but they're totally new for bishops in parts of the world where they play down or even deny that they have a clerical sex abuse problem.
Well, it's interesting, Sylvia, since this is a hierarchical organization, word comes down from the Pope normally, that in this case you have word coming up from victims, because victims are at this gathering. What are you hearing from them?
Oh, they're here in droves, and they're planning a big rally tomorrow. There's a great deal of anger, exasperation with the Pope. Here is Denise Buchanan, a Jamaican woman who's the co-founder of the group Ending Clergy Abuse.
When you consider that in the United States, the 13th Amendment was an end to slavery. Yes, there are problems, but that law made the difference. Why can't he do the same thing here? That law can end any abuse of children. It can end now.
Now, the Pope's proposals to the bishops were very concrete, but they fell short of victims groups' prime demand that it become universal church law that abuser priests and the bishops who cover up for them will be automatically dismissed from the clergy. In other words, zero tolerance. Up to now, the Vatican has always justified the absence of universal rules by saying that clergy could be unfairly persecuted in authoritarian states where Catholics are a threatened minority. And yesterday, the Vatican's top sex crimes investigator, Archbishop Charles Scicluna, stressed that dismissal decisions should be taken on a case-by-case basis.
Which sounds fair, but you can certainly understand people who would not trust the church to make that case-by-case decision. Is there reason to think that meaningful reform is on the way?
Depends on what part of the world we're talking about. Churches that have already been battered by scandals have adopted strict guidelines. Many parts of the world and cultures are nowhere near that. One of the summit organizers, Father Hans Zollner, pointed out that in many languages, including Italian, the working language at the Vatican, does not have the equivalent word for accountability, which he says means there hasn't been much reflection in these cultures. So probably some basic rules will be adopted, but you need to change the mindset, and that's going to take a long time.
Sylvia, thanks for your insights.
Thank you, Steve.
That's NPR's Sylvia Poggioli.
Well, the president and vice president are both on the road this week.
President Trump leaves today for Vietnam and a summit with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Vice President Mike Pence visits Bogota, Colombia. He's discussing the crisis in neighboring Venezuela and meeting U.S.-backed opposition leader Juan Guaido. Over the weekend, clashes between protesters and the military around the border left several people dead. The opposition was trying to bring in U.S. aid. So how far is the United States going to push this? Secretary of State Mike Pompeo spoke to Fox yesterday.
We're going to do the things that need to be done to make sure that the Venezuelan people's voice, that democracy reigns, and that there's a brighter future for the people of Venezuela.
All right, let's bring in NPR's Ader Peralta, who is covering this crisis. He's in Caracas. Hi, Ader.
Hi, David.
So talk to me about how these clashes broke out and how exactly they fit into the larger battle for power in the country right now.
So we're about a month into this experiment. It's been a month since Juan Guaido declared himself president in Venezuela. And over the past 2 weeks, they had built people up to this moment. They said they would bring in tons of humanitarian aid through the Colombian border. And they hoped that the military would turn their backs on Maduro, that they would watch this aid flow into the country and send a message to Maduro that they were no longer with him. But those things did not happen. Only little bits of aid came in, and more than 150 soldiers have defected. But by and large, what we have seen over the past 2 days is real repression. The military fired tear gas and paramilitary groups attacked protesters. One of the aid trucks was burned. And so the government is the one declaring victory. They say they have been able to repel a foreign invasion. But it is important to note that the opposition says they see the government reaction as an opportunity, that the regime has shown that it's repressive and it's cynical, and they hope that the international community further coalesces around them.
Well, not just the international community, but the opposition is hoping that a lot of Venezuelans will continue to stand with them and against Maduro. Is that the sense you're getting from talking to people on the streets?
People are still very much in this fight, but I've heard a lot of frustration. On Saturday, I was here in Caracas, and tens of thousands of Venezuelans, they completely surrounded a military base here, and they spent hours pleading with the military to join them. Not a single one of them did. Instead, as the crowd started thinning, some of the troops gave the protesters the middle finger. Now Caracas is back to normal, and lots of people went to the beach yesterday. I met Carolina there. She was with her friends. She was de-stressing, as she said. But what she said is that she's done. She used to like Hugo Chavez, but now she welcomes a foreign invasion. Let's listen to a bit of what she said.
Porque si a nosotros nos dicen a todos los venezolanos, vamos a salir para la calle, vamos a durar 30 días en la calle.
So she's saying if they tell us to be out in the streets for 30 days without eating to oust this government, we'd all be out there. And she just wants an end game, and she's ready for the consequences.
Well, you have Vice President Mike Pence arriving in Colombia to talk about all of this. To what extent is that heading towards some kind of endgame?
It's unclear. I mean, Vice President Mike Pence is coming to the meeting with a clear message that all options are on the table. But what that means, we don't know. Does it mean more diplomatic moves, or does it mean what everyone here is talking about, which is a first step toward a military intervention? Juan Guaidó, the opposition leader, hasn't been clear here.
All right. That was NPR's Ader Peralta reporting for us in Venezuela. Pope Francis is calling for an all-out battle against clergy sex abuse.
Yeah, he ended his first-of-a-kind summit at the Vatican yesterday with a speech in Italian.
La Chiesa vede il riflesso dell'ira di Dio.
Francis there is vowing to confront sexual abusers with the wrath of God. Victims of sexual abuse were hoping for more than speeches, and the Pope did not offer a clear plan to hold bishops accountable for predatory subordinates.
NPR's Sylvia Poggioli joins us now from Rome. She's been covering this summit. Hi, Sylvia.
Hi there.
So is that the take-home here? Very strong words, but no real concrete action?
Well, Vatican officials had tried to play down expectations on that front. What Pope Francis promised yesterday was that no abuse cases will ever be covered up again, and that national guidelines on preventing and punishing abuse will be strengthened. He said the church will listen to, watch over, protect, and care for abused, exploited, and forgotten children. He said it's time to eradicate this evil by adopting every necessary measure in force at international and church levels, and that it's time to provide uniform directives for the church. But he didn't say what those uniform directives will be.
Okay, so, the interesting thing, there were abuse survivors who were actually gathered in Rome for this meeting. I know you've been spending some time with them. Are they optimistic that the Pope is going to follow through here?
Absolutely not. There was huge disappointment. They had come here to demand much tougher measures. Ann Barrett Doyle, she's the co-founder of bishopsaccountability.org, which tracks clerical abuse in the church. She said the Pope's speech was a stunning letdown, a catastrophic misreading of the grief and outrage of the faithful. She called for new canon laws establishing a one-strike-and-you're-out policy for abuser priests and their bishop enablers. She said what's clear now is that accountability will come only from outside the church through civil law, and with activists around the world campaigning for stricter laws and police investigations. The unresolved issue here is victims' demands for zero tolerance. That means defrocking abuser priests and bishops who covered up for them. It was hardly mentioned at the summit, and when asked by reporters, church officials here claimed that removing a priest from ministry is a better way to protect the flock because the church, they say, can continue to monitor him, which they can't if he's kicked out of the priesthood.
So is this meeting going to change anything?
Well, summit organizers did announce some new measures after the Pope's speech. They said the Vatican will soon issue a handbook to help bishops around the world clearly understand their duties, and they're going to set up teams of experts to be sent to countries where local churches don't have the expertise or resources to handle abuse cases. For Pope Francis, the summit's main purpose was to convince those bishops who are still skeptical or even in denial that a global sex abuse crisis exists and has devastated the church's credibility. It was essentially a consciousness-raising tutorial for church leaders. In fact, the bishops heard searing, painful testimonies from victims. But more than Francis, I think it was Archbishop Mark Coleridge of Australia, a country rocked by the sex abuse crisis, who in his homily at the closing Mass gave bishops a very intense sense of urgency and shame.
We have shown too little mercy. We will not go unpunished. We have been our own worst enemy.
All right, a voice to end there. Covering the Vatican Summit for us, NPR's Sylvia Poggioli. Sylvia, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
All right, there's a whole lot of anticipation, some controversy, all leading up to Hollywood's biggest night last night, and now it has come and gone.
The 91st Academy Awards was the first ceremony in 30 years that did not have a formal host. Comedian Tina Fey, standing on stage with Amy Poehler and Maya Rudolph, made that clear at the start of the show.
We are not your hosts, but we're going to stand here a little too long so that the people who get USA Today tomorrow will think that we hosted.
Well, the format worked. People handed out awards, winners made speeches, and the show ended more or less on time.
More or less on time, but I'm assuming that our colleague covering it probably didn't get much sleep. NPR arts correspondent Mandalit Del Barco. Hi, Mandalit.
Hi, sleep? What do you mean? I'm still
Exactly.
up.
So what are some of the highlights that are sticking with you from last night?
Well, a real fun moment was when Spike Lee finally won his first competitive Oscar. Samuel L. Jackson opened the envelope for the adapted screenplay in which he won for Black Klansman. Just listen to this. So Spike Lee jumped up on Samuel L. Jackson. He was so excited. He had never won a competitive Oscar, although he did win a student Oscar at NYU and an honorary Oscar in 2015.
Wow.
He sipped champagne and he was answering questions in the press room where he seemed a bit upset about not winning for Best Picture. But
so a lot of emotions from Spike Lee last night in two different directions.
That's right. Another standout was Olivia Colman, who won for Best Actress for The Favorite, and she seemed so surprised and flustered and just hilarious. And then there was a really touching moment with Lady Gaga and Bradley Cooper. It was a really intimate duet that they sang, an Oscar-winning song from A Star Is Born.
Yeah, a real earworm for us all, and not a bad one. So some controversy, right, around Best Picture?
Well, yeah, Green Book. It was a bit of a surprise that Green Book won. It's a story set in 1962. The African-American pianist and his driver, Tony Vallelonga, and his son wrote the screenplay, and he won an Oscar for it. The filmmakers of Green Book failed to thank Don Shirley during their acceptance of their awards. And afterwards, also Shirley's family had been upset by the portrayal of it. But Frank Vallelonga, who he told reporters that he had gotten Don Shirley's blessing to tell the story.
And then complaints from the family, but winning Best Picture over movies like Roma and
right.
Black Panther. I mean, it was quite a list and such different movies.
Absolutely.
So no host. I mean, Steve and I don't like setting a precedent that you don't need a host, but the Oscars seem to pull off not having a host, right?
That's right. It's better than the last time they didn't have a host when Rob Lowe and Snow White sang. But maybe Amy, Tina, and Maya should have been the hosts.
Oh, really? Was that the reaction? I mean, they were maybe that's the goal next year. Have three great hosts.
So. Yeah, they were great.
NPR's Monalith Del Barco covering the Oscars last night. Hope you do get some sleep now.
Thanks. Take care.
When banks check their finances to see how they would do in a crisis, it's called a stress test. Think of today as a stress test for one part of the Constitution.
That's right, Article 1 to be precise, which establishes the powers of Congress. Many lawmakers in both parties say the president improperly seized those powers, spending money Congress denied him to build a border wall. The president claimed this authority by declaring a national emergency, and today House Democrats are expected to pass a resolution that would cancel that emergency. In the Senate, some Republicans also oppose the president. Alaska's Lisa Murkowski spoke to TV station KTUU.
I probably will be supporting the resolution to disprove, not because I disagree with the president, but because I think it's so important that there be clear lines when it comes to the separation of powers.
Separation of powers, getting back to that Constitution. Tamara Keith is NPR's White House correspondent and co-host of the NPR Politics podcast, and she's with us once again. Hi, Tam.
Good morning.
How's this process work?
So this process was actually written into the law, the National Emergencies Act, that gave the president the power to declare a national emergency. It also gave Congress the power to roll it back, to terminate it. And so the House is voting today. It's expected to pass because Democrats have a strong majority in the House. Then it goes to the Senate. Now, if you have watched Congress a lot, you know that often the Senate stalls or doesn't take up legislation. Mm-hmm. Well, they can't do that with this one. This is what's called a privileged resolution. It means it is on a fast track to a vote on the floor of the Senate.
But Republicans, who have generally supported the president, still have a majority in the Senate. How many Republicans besides Lisa Murkowski, who we just heard, are willing to defy the president, vote against him here?
Well, before he declared the emergency, there were a lot of Republicans telling him not to do it, that it would be usurping the congressional power of the purse. Since then, they've been a little bit more quiet about it, or have said, well, gosh, I really don't like it, but I don't know what I'm going to do. Last night, posted on the Washington Post website an op-ed from Tom Tillis, who's a Republican senator from North Carolina. He wrote an editorial saying that as a member of the Senate, he has grave concerns when his institution looks the other way at the expense of weakening Congress's powers. He says that he supports the president wanting to build the wall, but that he believes, quote, "It is my responsibility to be a steward of the Article 1 branch, to preserve the separation of powers and to curb the kind of executive overreach that Congress has allowed to fester for the better part of the past century." What we don't know is how many other Republican senators there are like him.
Well, I'm thinking about another Republican senator, Lindsey Graham, who has been notably supportive of the president after being notably critical of him during the presidential campaign. He gave an interview to the New York Times recently in which he said, not for the first time, that he supports President Trump because he wants to be relevant, wants to get things that he thinks are important for the country, also acknowledged that he wants to get reelected, and there are a lot of Trump supporters out there. How reluctant are Republicans to cross the president even at this moment when he's very unpopular?
Well, it depends on what state they're in and how red and Republican it is. But just before we go, very important to note that the president has said he will veto it if it gets to his desk. And it's not clear that there are really enough people of either party to add up to a veto-proof majority.
You would need a lot of Republicans to make a veto-proof majority.
A whole lot.
Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
That's NPR White House correspondent Tamara Keith. She speaks to us, by the way, on this day when the president himself is out of the country visiting Vietnam this week for a summit with North Korea's leader. Voters in Chicago go to the polls today to select their mayor, and they have a lot of choices.
Like a lot of choices. We're talking about 14 candidates, a record 14 candidates running to succeed former White House Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel, who is stepping down after 2 terms as Chicago's mayor. Among them is Bill Daley, another former White House Chief of Staff under Obama. His father was also mayor, as was his brother. But polls show that this race is still wide open in a city that is facing some significant challenges.
NPR's David Shaper is in Chicago and trying to keep track of the candidates. Hi there, David.
Good morning.
So, wow, you have almost as many mayoral candidates as there are potential presidential candidates in 2020. So how are you handling this?
Yeah, and enough flavors of ice cream, too. Yeah, you know, the one reason for this wide open race this year is that there's no incumbent. This is only the 4th time in the last century that a sitting mayor wasn't on the ballot. Last time was 2011 when Rich Daley chose not to run for re-election. But had Rahm Emanuel actually chosen to run again, there were several candidates already lining up against him, feeling he was vulnerable, particularly because of the fallout of the Laquan McDonald case. You remember Laquan was a 17-year-old who was shot and killed by a police officer. Oh, yeah. The trials of the police officer just happened last fall. Many people are unhappy with it, even though he was convicted with the sentence. So when Rahm got out of the race, even more candidates jumped in, including Bill Daley, as you mentioned, and a couple of other local political heavyweights. Tony Preckwinkle, who is president of the Cook County Board and chair of the County Democratic Party. Susanna Mendoza, who's the state comptroller and has some labor support behind her, as does Preckwinkle. Lori Lightfoot, a former federal prosecutor who's been pushing hard for police reform. There's a former police superintendent, a millionaire business owner, the list goes on and on. Even a young progressive who is endorsed by Chance the Rapper and Kanye West.
Sounds like police conduct is quite central to this campaign.
It's a really big issue, and it's a really big issue, particularly among younger voters who have kind of rallied and mobilized and tried to recruit people to register to vote. They turned out in very strong numbers in the November midterm elections, and the turnout for this election is a little questionable. Steve Vallis is with Chicago Votes, which is a nonpartisan group that works to engage young adults in politics.
If young people turn out and vote, we could elect the most progressive mayor in Chicago's history.
Although, of course, Chicagoans could also elect another daily. We're curious, David, when a daily is running, do they just use the same daily campaign signs around town they've been using since the 1950s?
No, they have a lot of money behind these candidacies, so they're able to print up new signs every election. So none of them are faded. And there is a kind of a trend here. Even Bill Daley is trying to almost out-progressive some of the other candidates in this race, trying to make him seem not as much like his father and his brother, who many people feel left the city with a legacy of inequality across the city and even racism, as many cities in the North do. But, all of the candidates are kind of trying to out-progressive one another, show their progressive credentials. And it's part of this trend that the Democratic Party is experiencing all across the country, as we saw in the November midterms. This could just echo those very similar themes across the country.
David, thanks for your insights. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Steve.
NPR's David Schaper is in Chicago, which holds a mayoral election today. Walmart, which is the largest private employer in the United States, is making a big change.
Yeah, it's a change that people who know Walmart and shop there will really, notice. The retailer confirmed to NPR that it is now eliminating its trademark front door job of people greeters in stores across the country and replacing them with this new position they're calling customer hosts. And this change in job requirements for the new position appears to be disproportionately affecting workers with disabilities.
And with us in our studios is NPR business correspondent Alina Selyuk. Hi there. Good morning.
Hello.
And you've been talking with some people with disabilities who've been Walmart greeters.
I've spent the past week hearing from greeters who are essentially expecting to lose their jobs on April 25th or 26th. All of them are people with disabilities. And they're worried because the new job of this host has requirements that can be pretty impossible if you're in a wheelchair. I've read the job description, and it says you must be able to, for example, lift 25 pounds or stand for long periods of time. And then to qualify for other jobs at the store, workers say they've been told that they must be able to climb a ladder, which is the same issue. And
the whole idea is to help people move around a crowded store and get stuff down. And
do a variety of things, including help shoppers load things into their carts. It varies by store. And this just happening in about 1,000 stores. And I've spoken to workers from 5 states. And one of them was Mitchell from Alabama, who's been a greeter for 4 years.
It gives me a place to go every day where I'm not sitting home. I'm able to work. I want to work. I want to be out in society.
We're not sharing Mitchell's last name because he's worried about retribution.
Absolutely. What is Walmart saying when you go to them with these concerns you've heard?
Yeah, Walmart has acknowledged the unique situation of workers with disabilities. And so the company actually told me it's now deciding to give greeters more time beyond April 25th to figure out their job situation. And Walmart is huge. It is one of the largest employers of people with disabilities. And the Americans with Disabilities Act does not preclude companies from changing job descriptions as they need. What the law does require is for companies to provide, quote, reasonable accommodations as long as the worker can do the essential functions of the job.
I have to say, though, this is one of the defining features of Walmart, is the Walmart greeter. It's got to be one of the few jobs in retail where everybody in America knows the name of the job, yes. Walmart greeter. Is this a huge change for Walmart?
It is, but it is currently just the latest wave of this. Walmart has been making this change in about 1,000 stores already. It's been happening since 2016. And to be honest, the frustrating part is that none of the workers I've talked to have actually seen any kind of document explaining this policy and its rollout. I spoke to the family of 2 workers who were affected by this last year. They're actually cousins, Joe and John Worth, both of whom use wheelchairs, and say they both lost their jobs as greeters in April. Here's John.
They were like, good luck with whatever you decide to do. It's just a handshake, and that made me feel like, oh, okay.
Well, he's clearly not okay. He's pretty distraught. It's messing up his income, his independence. He says back in April he took 2 buses to work like he usually does, only to discover his badge didn't work. Oh. The Worth cousins have a claim against Walmart with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in Michigan. I know of 2 other claims in Texas and Wisconsin, a lawsuit in Utah. Walmart has not commented on those to NPR.
Alina, thanks for digging into this. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's NPR's Alina Selyuk.
Today, a man who used to be one of President Trump's closest confidants will testify before Congress, and he will testify that President Trump committed a crime, not just during the campaign, but after he was inaugurated.
The crime here would be an illegal campaign contribution. Michael Cohen paid off an adult film star before the election, he says. Well, after the election, when Trump was in office, Cohen says the president reimbursed him by check. Cohen also makes a statement relating to the investigation of Russia's support for Trump's election. You will recall the United States blames Russia for the hacking of Democratic Party emails. Well, Cohen says he was present for a 2016 phone call in which Trump was told in advance that a leak of emails was coming.
NPR's Tim Mack covers national security and politics, and he is covering Michael Cohen's testimony, and he's in the studio. Good morning, Tim.
Good morning.
Let's start with this alleged crime. We knew before that Michael Cohen had said President Trump reimbursed him for hush money. Now, Cohen is expected to say in his testimony before Congress that this reimbursement happened while the president was in office.
Right, and he's got documents to show for it. In his prepared testimony, Michael Cohen is expected to say that President Trump personally signed a check from his personal bank account to reimburse money to Michael Cohen for this hush money. That's hush money that Cohen later pleaded guilty to campaign finance violations for. So in his prepared testimony, he lists several documents, including copies of checks and financial statements that he says supports his testimony. One of these checks is from Trump's personal bank account, written after he became president as late as August of 2017, paid to Cohen to reimburse him for those hush money payments to Stormy Daniels. Cohen also is expected to go into great detail about these payments made to Stormy Daniels in exchange for her silence about an alleged affair with Trump before he was president. He said the president, or is expected to say, that the president directed him to make these payments, describes it as a, quote, criminal scheme.
So Cohen is going to present other documents that don't paint the president in a good light, in particular related to WikiLeaks, right?
Yeah, one of the big questions during the campaign, and ever since, has been what foreknowledge, if any, did Donald Trump have about the WikiLeaks release of Democratic National Committee emails? Michael Cohen's expected to say that when he was a presidential candidate, he knew that Roger Stone was talking to Julian Assange about a possible WikiLeaks drop of DNC emails.
Roger Stone, longtime friend of President Trump.
Absolutely. And Michael Cohen is also expected to say and testify before Congress that Trump knew about that release of hacked DNC emails ahead of time. He's expected to have documents to support a lot of these allegations, including those talks about the Trump Tower project in Moscow. He's expected to say that Trump knew of and directed the Trump-Moscow negotiations through the campaign and lied about it. He's also expected to comment on Donald Trump's character. He's going to call him a racist. He's going to say that that he's heard Donald Trump say all sorts of nasty and bigoted things.
So all of that is going to be shocking to absorb today during this testimony. But this public hearing comes after a closed-door Senate panel yesterday, right? What did we learn from that, if anything?
So the nature of the Senate Intelligence Committee is that it is generally very secretive. But here's what Senator Mark Warner, he's the top Democrat on the Senate Intelligence Committee, here's what he had to say yesterday.
2 years ago when this investigation started, I said it may be the most important thing I'm involved in my public life in the Senate. And nothing I've heard today dissuades me from that view.
Yeah, but beyond these general statements, lawmakers have been pretty tight-lipped about what they learned in hours of marathon testimony.
So he's going to face by Democrats and Republicans today. Any sense of what specific questions he's going to have to tackle?
Well, he's going to be largely asked about questions about the Trump business, the Trump charities, and the Trump campaign. But Republicans are going to be pushing back very strongly against Michael Cohen. They're going to argue he's a liar. He's lied before Congress.
He's admitted to lying,
that. And he shouldn't be trusted here. He's not credible.
Which is the line from the White House and the president himself this morning. NPR's Tim Mack. Thanks so much, Tim.
Thank you.
So while Michael Cohen is testifying on the Hill about President Trump is very far away in Vietnam.
On behalf of the United States, I want to thank you very much for hosting, and hopefully great things will happen later on with our meeting.
That was the president ahead of his second summit with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. The negotiating teams are expected to discuss progress toward denuclearization on the Korean peninsula, although they've had a little bit of trouble defining what that would really mean. In return, North Korea would get the lifting of economic sanctions.
NPR's Anthony Kuhn is in Hanoi covering the summit. Good morning, Anthony.
Hey there, Rachel.
So you were in Singapore covering the first summit, and you remember there was all this pomp and circumstance to the actual moment, the moment these two leaders met. Are we going to see that again?
Well, you're going to see a similar sort of media circus, that's for sure. There are an awful lot of journalists here in a massive press center. They're staked out in front of hotels and stuff like that. And we've had some really made-for-TV moments. President Trump's arrival here was what you would expect, the usual motorcades and stuff. Kim Jong-un went through a 60-hour marathon by train all the way the length of China to get to Vietnam, and that was full of interesting made-for-TV moments like him catching a smoke break on the platform on his way here. So in terms of media, yes, it's a big spectacle, but I think the results of Singapore were less than what a lot of people were looking for, so expectations have come down a bit in terms of the actual deliverables.
Right, but, Singapore, you can kind of get away with just the historic nature of it, right? It was a big deal that these two were in a room together. They're not going to be able to lean so much on the theater this time. I mean, after Singapore, Trump said North Korea was no longer a nuclear threat. Even his Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, says that's not true. So what are the realistic expectations here for the Trump delegation?
Yeah, well, they're lower. The first time what the U.S. would have liked to have is a declaration of all of North Korea's nuclear assets. It wouldn't give those. North Korea says, look, we've done things since the summit. Last year they've frozen their nuclear tests. They've dismantled some nuclear and missile facilities, and now they want something in return. So the U.S. has appears to have lowered its expectations and is willing to take some sort of measures to lock in the freeze, to verify what's already happened, and to get some sort of roadmap for the process ahead, which they know is going to be long and complicated.
Is there any anticipation that there had been some speculation that President Trump might try to broker a so-called peace deal that would end the Korean War? Is that on the table?
It's been raised by a lot of sides. The South Koreans said that could be an outcome. People, of course, are just very concerned that, we don't strike a bad deal. Even a small deal would be better than a bad one, giving away too much just to look good on camera.
Right, and of course, South Korea would have to be substantively involved in that. NPR's Anthony Kuhn from Hanoi covering the summit. Thanks so much.
You bet, Rachel.
Okay, so while President Trump is talking about denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula, two other nuclear powers remain at odds.
To say the least. Pakistan says it shot down 2 Indian aircraft inside its airspace, and Pakistan also says it launched strikes on Indian-controlled Kashmir today. The Pakistanis say they've captured a couple of Indian pilots who were shot down. All this comes after India says its fighter jets did cross over into Pakistani-controlled territory and killed a very large number of terrorists. Pakistan says the Indian jets struck nothing. We should emphasize we don't have any independent confirmation of what has been destroyed, but both sides are shooting, and there are fears that tensions between these nuclear-armed neighbors could escalate.
NPR's Lauren Freyer has been reporting all this from India. Lauren, can you just get us up to speed on what we know in this moment and what the situation is on the ground?
Sure. So Pakistan says its Air Force shot down 2 Indian aircraft inside Pakistani airspace. It says they fell out of the sky on opposite sides of the line of control. That's the de facto border between the Indian and Pakistani areas of Kashmir. Kashmir is a divided territory that the two countries have long fought over. Right. Pakistan says Indian pilots of those aircraft have been arrested. Now, that's what Pakistan says. We're getting a very different story from the Indian government.
What are they saying?
So after hours of silence, the Indian government just made its first statement on this 2 minutes ago. A government spokesman came out and said it was the Indian Air Force that shot down a Pakistani plane, and that ground forces confirmed that they saw it falling from the sky. He also confirmed that one Indian pilot is missing in action, and he did not elaborate how that pilot went missing. So these are obviously different stories. I also want to tell you about some video, pretty dramatic video. Both Pakistani and Indian media are showing video of a man who says he is an Indian pilot blindfolded in custody. Now, we can't verify the nature. We can't verify that this video is legitimate, but he says his name and his service number on tape, and this video is circulating widely in both countries.
I mean, it is worth just for a couple moments, Lauren, just backing up and explaining how entrenched this conflict is, right?
It really is. So India and Pakistan have fought a number of wars since their independence from Britain in 1947. But the latest tension really started just shy of 2 weeks ago with a suicide car bomb that killed 40 Indian troops on the Indian side of Kashmir. Now, the bomber was a local Kashmiri man, but a Pakistan-based group claimed responsibility. India was very angry, and yesterday it says it retaliated with these airstrikes on a militant training camp inside Pakistan. It says it killed fighters there. Now, Pakistan denied any damage or casualties, but we've already seen Pakistan responding today, saying it's shot down these Indian planes. So there have long been tensions. Now it's turned violent, and you got to wonder when these tit-for-tat retaliations will stop.
NPR's Lauren Frayer in Assam, India, reporting on this for us. Lauren, thanks so much. We appreciate it.
You're welcome, Rachel.
In his books and speeches, President Trump has often promoted the power of walking away from a deal. And that is what he did in Vietnam today, ending a summit early with the leader of North Korea.
We had a really, I think, a very productive time. We thought, and Secretary Pompeo felt that it wasn't a good thing to be signing anything.
The president said that because there was supposed to be a signing ceremony, but it was canceled because in the end there was nothing to sign. The president spoke with reporters before heading to Air Force One. And essentially, the U.S. says this is the sticking point. The U.S. wants North Korea to give up all its nuclear weapons. And as of now, North Korea doesn't want to do that. President Trump said Kim was willing to close some, but not all nuclear sites. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo still tried to sound optimistic.
I'm hopeful that the teams will get back together in the days and weeks ahead and continue to work out. It's a very complex problem,
to say the least. So what to make of this? NPR's Anthony Kuhn is in Hanoi. NPR White House correspondent Scott Horsley is in Washington. Gentlemen, good morning.
Good morning.
Hey, Steve.
Or I should say good afternoon to Anthony Kuhn on the other side of the world. And Anthony, let's start with you. In a little more detail here, what was it the United States wanted?
At the very beginning, at the last summit, the U.S. had initially wanted a declaration of all of North Korea's nuclear assets, and then they wanted North Korea to hand them over. This time, its expectations were a little bit lower. It seems like they would have taken a freeze, dismantlement of facilities, and then verification. But then things fell apart. At his presser, Trump said that the deal fell apart because North Korea wanted the U.S. to lift sanctions before it dismantled its main nuclear plant at Yongbyon. And Trump said he just had to walk away from that deal. Let's hear what he said.
Basically, they wanted the sanctions lifted in their entirety, and we couldn't do that. They were willing to denuke a large portion of the areas that we wanted, but we couldn't give up all of the sanctions for that.
Anthony, you're talking about not just what the United States wanted out of North Korea and what North Korea wanted from the United States, but the order in which things would happen, right? That's
right.
Part of the problem?
Yeah, this has been the problem all along. Is it North Korea giving up its nukes first or the U.S. lifting its sanctions first? And, the two sides had been in talks, preparatory talks for the summit for weeks. On the face of it, it just seems incredible that they hadn't resolved this basic question. We don't know whether there was insufficient preparation, miscommunication, bad faith. It's just not clear. But there was also the issue that the U.S. wanted a bigger concession from North Korea. Yongbyon, of course, is not their only nuclear plant. They have other places where they make fissile material for nuclear bombs, and the U.S. apparently wanted those to be part of the deal, too, but Kim Jong-un was not willing to give those up.
But hey, Anthony, it's Rachel. Wouldn't they have known that in advance? I mean, as you say, there had been a lower-level team who had been negotiating. Secretary Pompeo had been to North Korea, who trying to lay the groundwork for this. So how did they not know that this would be Kim Jong-un's going-in position?
Yes, well, it's possible that one side added requirements at the end. There could have been some miscalculation. We just don't know. It'll be interesting to see what comes out of this soon.
Well, let's get some insight from Scott Horsley on that question, because, Scott, we do know that after that first summit, the North Koreans were asked for a lot and would only sign on to this rather vague and very brief communique, and that they'd missed a bunch of meeting appointments in the months since then. Were there signs that this was falling apart on the way in?
Certainly there was skepticism. We heard leaders of the U.S. Intelligence Committee briefing Congress and saying North Korea had done little in a concrete way to show any commitment to denuclearization, and skepticism that Kim would ever really want to dismantle a nuclear arsenal that he and his father and grandfather saw as key to the survival of their regime. On the other side, though, we have heard people within the administration saying there were some signs of progress in the 8 months since the Singapore summit, and that Kim himself had recommitted to denuclearize in a New Year's speech. So there's still room, as Secretary of State Pompeo says, to move forward from here. The president stressed that the talks ended amicably, that this was not so much a breakdown in negotiations, but more of a pause. And Trump also stressed that this is not a return to nuclear brinksmanship.
One of the things, importantly, that Chairman Kim promised me last night is, regardless, he's not going to do testing of rockets and nuclear, not going to do testing. So, I trust him, and I take him at his word. I hope that's true.
That is not the only time that said he trusted Kim Jong-un and takes Kim Jong-un at his word.
That's right. There was some discussion about the fate of Otto Warmbier, the American student who was held captive in North Korea and released only to die soon after returning home. The president said that Kim was aware of that case, but only afterwards, that he assured the president he didn't direct the mistreatment of Otto Warmbier. And again, the president said he takes Kim at his word there, once again showing sort of a soft spot for tyrants.
Right, but he says he trusts him, but trust but verify, right? I mean, this is what conservatives and Republicans like to quote Reagan as saying all the time, but they can't verify because they didn't get inspectors allowed into North Korea. So how do they move forward at this point? It's been 2 summits now. What happens?
I think that's going to be the question. Where there was no promise of an immediate follow-on summit, but we did hear Secretary of State Pompeo saying hopefully the lower level teams can go back at it and perhaps work on where they go from here.
Anthony Kuhn, let's give you the last word in this part of our coverage, because there has been this assumption, this belief that North Korea just looks at its interests, perhaps quite rationally, and concludes that the survival of the regime depends on some kind of nuclear deterrent to keep a country like the United States from going after regime change. Is that, from where you sit, does that appear to be still the way the North Koreans see it? They'd like to make some deal, they'd like to be part of the international community, they'd like to get sanctions lifted, but they're just not willing to give up everything.
Well, I think it's clear that, for them, if they bargain away their nukes, the price has to be right. They have to get what they want. But, a lot of people also argue that economics are a very big part of this. They can't keep going the way they are with the sanctions on them, and that Kim is serious about economic reform. And today's result really left South Korea in the lurch, because they were counting on economic engagement moving ahead with a lot of projects which would tie the two countries' economies together. So right now we really have to see how the North Koreans are going to react to this. Are they going to accuse the U.S. of acting in bad faith? Are they going to say, it's okay, we'll go ahead with more negotiations later? Or are they going to take a more hostile tack?
And Kim Jong-un wins because he is seen on the international stage as being legitimized again.
Could be.
Plenty of photos of Kim Jong-un on an equal footing with President Trump. NPR's Anthony Kuhn has been reporting from Hanoi, where the summit took place. NPR's Scott Horsley is here in Washington. Thanks to you both.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
And there is so much more to discuss today, because while the president was in Vietnam to talk about North Korea and talk with the North Korean leader, he also paid some attention to the testimony of his former lawyer, Michael Cohen.
I tried to watch as much as I could. I wasn't able to watch too much because I've been a little bit busy.
Yeah, Cohen was testifying yesterday before the House Oversight Committee.
I am ashamed because I know what Mr. Trump is. He is a racist. He is a con man. and he is a cheat.
Cohen testified publicly that the president committed a string of acts. Notably, he said the president reimbursed him for hush money that was paid to an adult film star, payments for which Cohen is now going to jail.
For more now, we're joined by NPR Justice reporter Ryan Lucas, who's been covering this story for quite some time. Ryan, good morning.
Good morning.
Cohen made a lot of statements about acts that we'd heard about before, I think, if we were following this closely. What did you learn that you didn't know?
Well, you're right. A lot of this is stuff that we had heard before. The big difference here, though, was that Cohen was making these allegations in front of cameras. This was in public. There was one big allegation that Cohen made that was new. He said that Trump knew ahead of time about WikiLeaks plans to release stolen emails that would damage Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign.
Oh, this is a central part of the whole idea of Russian interference in the 2016 election.
Right. He says he was in Trump's office in July 2016 when Trump's longtime informal advisor, Roger Stone, called. He says Trump put Stone on speakerphone. Cohen says Stone told them he had just spoken with the WikiLeaks founder, Julian Assange, and that he said a big email dump would happen in the next few days. A big email dump did happen a few days after Cohen says this call took place. WikiLeaks and Stone both deny Cohen's account on this. There's one other thing that stuck out. Cohen said he knows of illegal activity regarding Trump that he can't discuss because it's part of an ongoing investigation in New York. It's unclear what he was referring to, but certainly points to possible legal jeopardy for the president.
The kind of thing that perhaps lawmakers would ask him about today as he continues his testimony now in private. Now, President Trump in Vietnam was asked one question about Michael Cohen during this press conference about the summit, after the summit, and this is what he had to say.
He lied a lot, but it was very interesting because he didn't lie about one thing. He said no collusion with the Russian hoax.
Is that true? Michael Cohen said there was no collusion between President Trump and Russia?
Cohen said that he knows of no direct evidence that Trump or his campaign colluded with Russia. He did say, though, that he had his suspicions. He added at one point that he was not in the campaign. He doesn't know all of the conversations that Trump had with people. And he added that there are a lot of dots. They all seem to lead in one direction. But for Democrats, many of whom were hoping for a big revelation on this point from Cohen, they left empty-handed.
Very briefly, how did Republicans on this committee push back?
Republicans went after Cohen's credibility from the very beginning. They called him a liar. They pointed to the fact that he has pleaded guilty to lying to Congress. He's pleaded guilty to tax evasion, that this is not a man that can be trusted. You cannot take what Michael Cohen says at face value.
Here's how Cohen responded to that.
I'm responsible for silliness because I did the same thing that you're doing now for 10 years. I protected Mr. Trump for 10 years.
And Michael Cohen gets the last word here, I suppose. Ryan Lewis, thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
NPR Justice reporter Ryan Lucas on this dramatic day.